Christine. Welcome to my podcast, Unmuzzled at 67. And today we are still in series 2. We're now on episode 5. I'm sorry about the mistake I made last week, confusing everybody. So we're back on track now. So welcome. It's great to have your company as always. And before I start, let's do a wee recap on what I was talking about last week. So just a lot of fucking carry on, isn't it really, with this gangster carry on? I mean, you have to say to yourself, how could anyone ignore all these red flags? How could anyone ignore red flags the size of these? They were huge. Just insanity. Let's leave that behind now. And we're going to move on to this episode today, which is actually in 2 parts. It's called Life Lessons and Life Experiences. I just kind of wrote these kind of together because I wanted to speak about them because they are part of my story. So let me kick off with part 1. And this is about a harsh life lesson that I had to learn. But as I say, it's part of my story. Here we go. So today I want to share with you a situation that maybe you have experienced yourself, or you might know someone who's experienced this. One thing that blighted my life from the very first job I had all those years ago was that I could not manage money for my whole working life. And as I worked in hospitality for most of my life, which, as you probably know, is notoriously badly paid, we're notoriously overworked, and the huge commitment expected as a norm. Because of that, I couldn't even get a second job because I was working a 12-hour day in most cases. I had very, very little time for my family and even less time for myself. So my salary was consumed with just getting on with life. There was never any spare money. In fact, I never saved a penny in my whole life. One of my character traits was that I just could not face reality, especially if it was unpleasant. I just ignored red flags. We all know that I can do that. And I buried my head deeper in the sand. And that's what I did with my mounting credit card bills. In those days, just put the letters in the bin. Until the inevitable day dawned that I did have to face up to the situation. And although, quite honestly, I was absolutely terrified of the consequences after months of denial, I finally opened the letters and I looked at the statements and I was beyond shocked at just how much I had spent. On what? I had nothing to show for it. And I can't even tell you how much it was. It was just so embarrassing. It was crisis time for me. I knew I could never pay a bill like that, ever. So while I was still feeling brave, I called the Citizens Advice Bureau and made an appointment. I was sitting in the waiting room, waiting for my turn to go in, and I was physically shaking from head to toe. And when I did go in, I couldn't speak. I was that nervous that no words would come out. But the man was kind and patient. He brought me some water and he told me to take my time. And finally, I was able to tell him why I was here. And I showed him the paperwork that I had brought, the credit card statements. He said, you need to speak to a proper financial person. And we do deal with people like that. So I'll make an appointment for you as soon as possible. And remember, and take all your correspondence with you and take the actual credit cards as well. I was quite surprised at how relaxed the guy was. He told me not to worry. It'll be sorted. He said, these things happen all the time. I don't know what I expected. I think I probably expected him to judge me, I think. But I didn't realise, and I wasn't thinking, that he would hear this kind of story every day. So after lots of worry and sleepless nights, I turned up for my appointment at the offices of the company that had agreed to see me and to find out if they would be able to help me. I was really worried about what they were going to tell me, and I was preparing myself for the worst case scenario. But this man was also very patient. He listened to me and he said I will be able to help you. And his advice was to sign a trust deed for 5 years, not to go bankrupt, as I could well lose my house. And that was my main worry. I had no idea what a trust deed was. I mean, this is more than 20 years ago. But he was an older man, and I felt a man that I could trust and clearly had a lot of experience. So I took his advice and I said I would go ahead. So he did his job. He contacted all the credit card companies and told them what was happening. And he did that side of things. And then he did a summary of my outgoings. And he looked at and suggested things that maybe I could do without, things that I could maybe cut back on. And then he came up with a monthly fee that I would pay them, and he would pay the credit card company. So in other words, the trust deed meant that he took over the debt and I had to pay it. I mean, as it turned out, there was a small amount of the debt paid off, and actually, looking back, that company got more money than the credit card companies. I didn't know that at the time. I was just living in terror. I was living in fear, and I just needed desperately somebody to guide me. I couldn't even look the guy in the face. I was absolutely mortified that I had got myself into this mess. And of course, I couldn't tell anyone. The monthly payment he suggested was a high monthly payment over 5 years, and it meant there was almost no spare money. And I didn't really have the courage to say, how am I going to manage if there's an emergency, or if suddenly I need to put my hands on some cash. This was just leaving me, with no backup whatsoever. But I was too ashamed. I was racked with guilt. And I regarded these next 5 years as my penance, my punishment for being so reckless with the small amount of money I had earned. I tried to analyse it, and I realised that because my salary was so small, that what I had been doing was supplementing it with fairly small amounts of money from a credit card. But this was just for, I don't mean day-to-day stuff, but it wasn't for a holiday or a brand new car or anything like that. It just was drip, drip, drip. And I just must have thought, because I belong in the delusional state, that one day this would resolve itself. Always delusional. But here I was faced with the reality and the consequences of my actions. And it looked pretty grim and worrying. But I had to suck it up and deal with it. I was not and am not a brave person. I just wanted to run away. I really found it hard to face up to and hiding the shame from everyone. I remember during my 5-year trust deed, I was working with a younger guy than me, who said to me one day, "Christine, I'm going to need to be early tomorrow. I'm going to sign a trust deed." And even then, in those days, trust deeds were really not common. It was bankruptcy that was the usual sort of emergency debt situation. But when the other staff asked him, what is a trust deed? He was very happy to tell them. He had no remorse. In fact, he had no emotional attachment whatsoever. He was calm and collected. And it was quite interesting to compare our very different reactions to the same situation. This young guy had a healthy attitude towards it. It had happened, he was getting on with it, and he was dealing with it. Me, on the other hand, I was brought up in the 60s when cash was king. Debt to my mum and dad was an absolute no-no. My parents saved for what they wanted, be it a sofa, a washing machine, whatever it was. They just waited. They waited until they had the cash and they paid it. And that is the standards that I was brought up with. So thank God both of my parents had passed, because I couldn't have looked them in the eye. They would have been so disappointed in me getting myself into such a mess, especially at this age. I mean, I would be in my 40s then. I mean, I wasn't a young girl. I mean, I know this credit card thing happens to a lot of young people and they go over it and they get back on track. But, I just could not come to terms with how I had let this happen. I really was I felt I was hiding in the shadows for these 5 years. It was really quite grim. And again, I found it quite hard to come to terms with, personally, with what had happened. How I could have behaved so recklessly, spending money that I actually didn't have and nothing to show for it. But worse than that, a major factor in me delaying facing up to my mountain debts was my constant business ideas. My business concepts, mostly completely madcap and never thought through. One idea after another, each idea more mental than the one before. And I got so emotionally caught up in every single one, and without exception, truly believed that this time was going to be the one. This would be the one that would make me successful and would make me enough money to clear my debts. That old word, delusional. So why was I trying to start up a business and amongst all this long hours that I was working and stress? Well, I've already mentioned that it was primarily to try to clear off these debts. But also I wanted out of hospitality. I hated that work. And there's no doubt that all that hate and that resentment did take its toll. And honestly, I was disappointed in myself. And because I didn't make the effort to get out of it. It was one of these uncomfortable comfort zones. And it is important to mention as well that these fucking business ideas, they cost money to action and to pursue. Money I didn't have. So to rid myself of the guilt of that, I would say, this is an investment in my future. On the other hand, the sad irony is that I actually became very good at my job, the one I hated. And I was headhunted regularly, particularly in my later years, working in some fabulous hotels. But it was one of the ones that didn't mean anything to me. None of these successes meant a single thing because I hated and resented the job and I resented myself. So none of my business ideas came to anything, except the one with Rab. Imagine choosing him. That idea could have gone somewhere, but clearly it was in the wrong hands. And I had to finally admit that, and hence the trust deed had to be actioned. So let's get back to the trust deed. Only the essentials were able to be bought for the 5 years. Credit cards were cut up and there was no extra cash anywhere. I would never in my life ever have asked anyone to lend me money. Ever. I don't think I ever have and never will. So that wasn't an option for me. But then a situation arose where I needed cash urgently. And this is when I made the biggest mistake of all. I cashed in my private pension and didn't tell the trust deed people. If I had told them I had money, I would have been in trouble. They would have taken it immediately and used it to pay the debt. So I was a wee bit fly. This was the only source of money I had. My back was against the wall. What can I say? Except that this was my only option. But in life, sometimes we make decisions where the consequences are long term. And this was one of those decisions. But as Tony Robbins says, I'm a big fan of Tony Robbins, by the way, don't look back. You're not going that way. So most of the pension money was needed and a very small amount was left over. So the 5 years were really tough and stressful. But I did make it through and I did get back on my feet and my credit rating was finally restored, eventually restored. I had learned a hard and valuable life lesson. I had been struggling in my own financially for years. And I regularly, as I said, used my credit cards to top up, or if there was a big purchase needed that my salary could not support. And I was a single parent. No, I'm not using any of these as an excuse. All I'm saying is that it's not always big purchases that can create large debt. It can be just spending more than you're earning and regularly using small amounts that over time can put you on a slippery slope. I also learned that any idea, business or otherwise, that comes from a place of desperation will generally not be successful. Not in my case, anyway. I never really thought anything through. I just poured lots of emotion into it with no proper foundation. And sometimes I got other people involved with just a fucking nightmare. I never took on board how my friends would roll their eyes when I would say, listen, I've got a great new business idea. They had heard it all before. But I was just like Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses. This time next year, I'll be a millionaire. Looking back, I see how not being able to properly trust anyone to share my worries and my concerns and anyone to look to for advice meant I had no one in my corner. And when you're facing some of life's real difficulties, that could have made a difference to me, I do think, if I'd had someone to confide in. Just like, I suppose, the way that, when I had Jimmy, my sponsor in AA, he's probably the only person in the world that I've actually had to completely tell the story from start to finish with, leaving absolutely nothing out. But when he passed, I guess my heart just closed. Even to those I was close to. I mean, yes, I could talk you to death, and I still can. But I never would mention any of my doubts, my worries, or my concerns. It was just acting. It was just masking. And I got so used to doing that, I couldn't remember any other way of living. So I'm going to bring this episode, this section of this episode to an end by saying it's never too late to speak your truth, because the truth really does set you free. And be authentic. This is also a wonderful freedom. And lastly, don't wait till you're 67 to be unmuzzled. So here comes part 2, called Life Experience. Here's a situation you will probably have to face in your life if you haven't faced already. When one or both of your parents get old, even elderly, and get sick, be it mentally or physically, and the part you might have to play. This is my story of when this happened in my family. If you've listened to the podcast, you will know how from a very early age, up until my 30s really, till I had my son, I put my parents through the mill. So when my mum started to behave quite oddly, putting dishes into the washing machine, leaving the gas on, constantly losing her bag or her purse, and forgetting just everyday ordinary things, my first thought was, maybe it was me. Maybe it was all the stress I put her under after all these years that had taken its toll. But when she threw my dad out of the house one night, saying she didn't know who he was, and accused him of following her home from the park, and what we needed to do as a family to cope with that situation, that's what we're going to talk about. On the one hand, you've got my dad feeling so hurt and rejected by his wife, throwing him out, not recognising him, and he's only there with his PJs and a dressing gown on. Then you've got my mum, who was truly frightened that a strange man was in her house. And she said she wasn't that kind of girl. Funny, but not funny, really. Up until this point, my dad was in complete denial that there was something really wrong with my mum. But by that time, he finally agreed that something needed to be done. And so began the long process of appointing a social worker and getting an appointment to get my mum diagnosed. Long and harrowing, not just for us, for the family, but also for my mum too. Very occasionally, she would have lucid moments where she would say to me, "Something really wrong with me, isn't there?" But before I could even reply, her wee eyes clouded over and she was gone. She was back into her own wee world. It was just heartbreaking. But when she was finally diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, at the start it was a relief to know what it was. But as there was no cure for this, our hearts were broken into again. So we started to look at nursing homes because it was clear she wasn't able to stay in the house. And we finally found one in Bearsden. And when she was finally admitted, we all gave a sigh of relief. My poor dad hadn't been able to sleep or relax for, you're probably going into years now, while my mum was at home, because you just didn't know what she would do next. And she was often up during the night doing things. So after a long time of having no sleep, he was able to sleep. He was able to watch TV, get back to reading his books, and slowly started to get back to his old self again, because there was no doubt that the stress and the worry had really taken its toll. My dad was a constant visitor. A minimum of 3 times a week he went to the home to see my mum, and I went on Sundays. I was still working these long 12, 13-hour shifts. But from the very first visit, my mum didn't know any of us. And that was quite hard to take. But, when I think it is almost a fact, I don't like saying that, but I think it can happen that when people are admitted into nursing homes, they do go downhill rapidly. That seems to be what happened, and that's definitely what happened to my mum. She never knew us, and she would always ask, "Who are you?" And she would always say, "Thank you for coming to visit me today." My dad, by this time, understood that this was all part of an illness, and we just all had to get used to it. Sometimes when we visited, she would be in a state of agitation. She'd be looking for something or worried about something. But other times were so memorable for good reasons, was that we would sometimes sing some of the well-known songs that my mum would sing from during the Second World War, which always brought the other residents over to join us, and they would sing along. Or they would just show that they were enjoying something that sounded familiar. But those days didn't last very long, and my mum deteriorated quickly. She could no longer speak, and she would just stare at us. And again, that's, it is quite difficult to deal with that, particularly in the confines of a nursing home. But like all families who go through something like this, we just had to deal with it and we had to get on with it. But out of all this sadness and even despair, my dad, who was broken to see his wife of 50 years in such a state, he still gazed at her with absolute love. He could see past her current physical and mental state, and he could still see the pretty young woman he fell in love with all those years ago. Theirs was a true love story. My mum was in that nursing home for 7 years. And we never missed a Sunday, and my dad never missed any of his visits. For the last year of her life, my poor mum could not do anything. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear, she couldn't eat, she couldn't do anything for herself at all. It was truly, really depressing to see a woman who had been so vibrant, so glamorous, a real matriarch, and also extremely kind and generous to everyone she met in her life. What a way to end your life. And when she did finally pass, it really was a relief. But for my dad, it was very difficult. This really was the end of their life together. My dad had no issues mentally, and you could see him often walking in the park with his beloved retriever, Monty. And I used to say they looked like two old gentlemen walking at the same slow pace. So for some families, there truly is a role reversal in that we have to look after our parents. After all, they've looked after us for our whole lives. Some, like me, still working full time. But I think this is the time, for me anyway, we need to prioritise our parents' needs the way they prioritised ours. And when my dad finally died, I felt that I was an orphan. For the first time in my life, I had no parents in my life. It was an odd, moving experience. We scattered my parents' ashes where they had requested, and in time we got on with our lives. But it's my belief that when a parent dies, there's a little hole in your heart that belongs to them that no other human being can fill. We all find it hard to accept that our parents are getting older. And although we know there is one certainty in life, and that is that we're all going to die, we're never prepared for it. I'm proud to say that I've inherited my dad's love for exercise and most of the foods that he loved. And I also have been taking vitamins since I was in my 20s. I was brought up watching my dad take his vitamins. There was no Holland and Barrett's in the 60s. He used to receive his from the USA. He would send away from them from the back of newspapers, adverts. And he was also, like me, never aware of his age and never let it stop him getting on with what he wanted to do. After his double heart bypass, he started running. He was in his 70s now, and he completed several marathons. He was a dad to be proud of. He was a bit of a loner. He didn't actively seek friendships, though he was popular with everyone. He was often referred to as the Highland gentleman. And he also, now what would it be, in his 80s, he learned to speak Arabic. And he could also speak French. He was just a lifelong learner. As for my mum, I definitely inherited her reactiveness, not always thinking things through, could start a fight in an empty house. Yes, I got her feistiness. But she was also compassionate, very kind and generous, and she loved a bit of bling. She loved getting dressed up. So I have some of these traits, but not all. I hate getting dressed up. And I also have a hardness to me that she didn't have. But all in all, my parents were good people. They were decent and they were respectable and very much in love right till the end. I was always a daddy's girl from the point of view that I got on better with him. Maybe my mum and I were just too alike. I enjoyed my dad's company as I got older. He was very interesting and a very low-key person. He just did what he wanted to do. He always had a new project in the go. And in later years, when he did venture into the town to the one and only Holland and Barrett's in St. Vincent Street, if he saw anyone or heard anyone speaking Arabic, he would be over to them in a flash, introduce himself. He was desperate to use his Arabic, his newly acquired Arabic language. So what I've talked about today will be a part of almost everyone's story. Thankfully, more is known about this illness my mum had today, and perhaps the process is a little bit easier, a little bit kinder. I hope so. It certainly was a distressing time with my mum. But these days, I choose to remember her as a glamorous, compassionate soul who gave her last, especially to the beggars in the town. Look at that wee soul, she would say, and she would give him everything she had. She would just keep her bus fare to get home. So I've got treasured memory of my parents, and I'm grateful that I was brought up in a warm, secure environment, had great family holidays and a dog, and all those factors I always took for granted. And you know my history with my mum and dad, especially when I was younger. But with an older, clearer head, I see they did the best they could with a child they did not understand and made their lives difficult and stressful. So here ends the double down of an episode. Another part of the ups and downs of my life story. So thanks for your company today. I hope you've enjoyed this. And remember, if you have, please tell your friends and family. It's always great to have as many people as possible. So thanks for your company today. And I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.